I'm on the phone with a consulting client earlier this week, and we found a very interesting set of statistics in their webinar data that led us to a very confident assumption of needing a particular metric, webinar over webinar over webinar, to have an 80% upward probability of success with what they define success to be whenever they execute these webinars. Whereas at the same time, if it fell below only by a handful of registrants, a particular benchmark, which I'll cover with you here in this video, their success rate with that webinar would go from 80% to 20%. Now, this isn't some made up like 80-20 rule stuff. This is really how their statistics played out. And once again, I'll demonstrate that to you with their data inside of this video today. In addition to that, I'll cover one of the most important lessons in hitting $1 million months, which is removing randomness as a variable and increasing certainty levels that you actually know what's going on in your data to be able to make confident decisions, spend enough money, and to be able to hit, once again, $1 million months. If you're new to the channel, welcome in. My name's Jeremy Haynes, and the entire intention of this channel is to help you hit $1 million months if you haven't figured that out yet. All my videos are about it. I'd encourage you to check them out. To be clear, I've helped over 38 different businesses now hit $1 million months, and I'm hopeful that you'll be one of the next ones. To be clear, as I mentioned in the intro here for today's video, it's very important you understand there's times in your data where you're gonna be able to see patterns and recognize very key inflection moments where you have to reflect on those lessons, successfully implement them for every single time that you move forward month over month over month in whatever strategies, ads, or funnels your business is currently implementing. So in this particular example, this client's running a call funnel. And in addition to that, they're running a webinar funnel. Two very common strategies for high ticket businesses to deploy. In addition to that, some DM ads when trying to hit $1 million months. Okay, so I'll go through today the webinar data specifically, and then I'll use another client example because they're just starting to figure this data out, and I'll tell you what specifically they're doing to try to start figuring it out so you can ideally do it too. To be clear, our first example is this webinar, okay? So the most recent 3 webinars for this specific client have just bombed. Like, they've just done a horrendous job. They've barely net any money, okay? And this client historically, if you look at this data here on this chart, so we go back as far as July, and there's a few columns to look at here. First of which is date. The second column, B here, represents the quantity of registrants. Third column represents the conversion rate of that specific webinar. Column D represents the net revenue of that specific webinar, and column E represents their paid in fulls in comparison to the quantity of people doing payment plans on those same webinars. Now, to be clear, I could add some additional data like ad spend, all kinds of stuff, click-through rate, page conversion rate, all kinds of stuff. But for this specific data to only show and represent what you see here in front of you today, it all boiled down to one simple thesis I had, okay? So keep in mind, the most recent 3 webinars have bombed. If we just go back real quick and we look once again at the net for all these columns that you see here, once again in column D, we can see that, it ranges from 25K, 40K, 51K, an outlier at only 7,500, 17K, 32K, 50K, and then the most recent 3, 11,000, 8,000, and then negative 8,000. So there was clearly something going on here. The reason that we also pulled this specific data starting at July 28th through the most recent webinar prior to me filming this September 26th was because July 28th is when they made a key decision in their webinars to change it a little bit. Okay? To be clear, when we looked at this specific data, my original thesis was, okay, if we have at least 2,000 webinar registrants, we have a really high probability of having a successful webinar. They defined a successful webinar to be, I'm gonna net at least $25,000. I want to disclose, because this channel is all about making $1 million a month. This specific funnel for them at one point used to be a huge driver, because this is a business that does a couple $100,000 a month. When trying to take it to $1 million plus months, it's important that we amplify what already works, which is what we're intending to do here. But in addition to that, we got these guys doing call funnels, DM ads, and they're focusing obviously on scaling that up as well. To be clear, numbers aside, they consider a $25,000 net amount to be a good webinar, okay? Just so we're clear on that statistic. As I said, historically, well before July 28th as well, they've had a lot of those webinars. They've had tons for years in a row that have net more than 25K and been good webinars. Now, to be clear, as I mentioned, most recently things have been bad. So my thesis was, if we get at least 2,000 people to register, we're gonna have a good webinar and achieve more than 25K net. So I wanted to map the specific data that could prove or disprove that thesis. A lot of marketers, they kind of drown in data because they're not looking for anything specific. It's like going to the doctor and articulating symptoms and the doctor just looking at every single thing that goes on inside of the human body They'd have to master all of human anatomy to be able to figure things out. And to be clear, it'd be a hell of a process to go through literally top to bottom the human body and all anatomy and everything associated with it just to determine how somebody's sick. That's why they typically will ask for symptoms. So they have a much higher probability of knowing where to look, what to think with. So therefore they can make their list of probabilities, run some tests and try to gather some additional data that then increase or decrease their certainty levels relative to the probability list they created, and then conclude to what it probably is and diagnose it and help treat it. That's all we got to do as marketers. We got to first define like symptoms and things that are going on. Then we got to create our list of probabilities, our thesis of what we think could be going on. From there, we have to find data, run some tests in some instances that further increase or decrease our certainty levels, and then we make conclusions and we move forward from there. In this case, that's why I gathered this specific data: dates, registrants, conversion rates, the net revenue, and the pay in fulls. Okay? So to be clear, here's what I noticed. The number wasn't 2,000 registrants. It ended up being 500 less. The quantity of registrants that made the tipping point difference to a really successful webinar, or at least a really high probability of a successful webinar, versus a really dramatically lower probability of a successful webinar, was 1,500 registrants. So I want you to look at this data with me real quick, okay? I'll highlight this for you. So first of all, August 4th, August 11th, August 18th, August 29th, and September 5th. That's 5 out of our 10 total webinars that had more than 1,500 registrants. Okay, so here's when this data starts to become important. Ignore the conversion rate. It doesn't really make a big difference in this case because you can see if you just look at it overall, it varies dramatically. And sure, the most recent webinar had a 2.86 conversion rate, and that's the one that lost money. So obviously it makes a difference, to be fair, when it comes to the profitability of an overall webinar and the amount of revenue that's going to come from it. But ignore that. That's one of those things that you can kind of get lost in if you just focus and isolate your attention to that. You'd start asking questions like, oh, what lowered the conversion rate? And that's not, to be fair, once again, it's not a bad set of questions to start to explore, but watch what happens here, okay? So remember, August 4th, August 11th, August 18th, August 29th, and September 5th. Those all had 1,500 plus total registrants. Now, if you look at these same webinars, okay? So for August 4th, $39,892. For August 11th, $51,523. That's net. Now, for August 18th, that one had above 1,500. It had 1,994 total registrants, but it only net 7,535. August 29th, at 1,595 registrants, had $32,011. And then lastly, September 5th, the last one that had above 1,500 registrants, 1,554 total registered and $50,012. Strong correlation, okay? To be clear, the one other thing that I noticed, and I actually ended up adding column E here for the pay in fulls later, was does the quantity of registrants that we get also increase the probabilities of having more pay in fulls? Logically it would, so I needed to map that column in order to figure it out. Watch this. So remember, August 4th, more than 1,500 registrants, it had 17 pay in fulls. August 11th, 2,403 registrants, 19 pay in fulls. August 18th, 9 pay in fulls. August 29th, 14 pay in fulls. And that September 5th date, the final 1,500 plus registrant webinar, 17 pay in fulls. So then I kind of drew a line in the sand. I said anything that has a greater quantity of 10 in terms of pay in fulls, that also has led to a dramatically greater amount of revenue being captured. So there were two strong metrics that I immediately understood here. Okay? If it was above 1,500 registrants, I had two strong statistical variables that were now clear to me. 4 out of 5 of the webinars in this table that had more than 1,500 registrants ended up being net above their good webinar number, above 25K. In addition to that, 4 out of 5 of those webinars that had above 1,500 registrants had more than 10 pay in fulls. That meant 4 divided by 5, 80% of the time, if we had above 1,500 registrants, we would have an 80% chance of having a net good webinar. Made sense to me. Then I needed to look at the opposite to see if the thesis proved true on the other side and what those ratios would look like in comparison in terms of probabilities of success or failure. So we look at July 28th. July 28th, 1,332 registrants. It was right below $25,000. We all argued on our consulting call that it's $10 off, $24,990. We're gonna call that a good webinar at 25K net. It also had above the 10 pay in full number. It had 11. But remember, less than 1,500 registrants. So August 22nd, 1,203 for our total registrants, only $17,965 net and only 9 pay in fulls. So below the 10 and below the 25K. September 12th, our third third webinar now below 1,500 only had 371 registrants. There were some ad spend issues apparently on this specific week. We had a total of $11,785 net with such low registrant count, by the way. You're probably wondering how the hell that worked out. Well, it had 6 pay-in-fulls, but it had a conversion rate of 12%, which is pretty fucking sweet. All right, our fourth webinar below 1,500 only had 1,069. It only net 8,394 and it had 9 pay-in-fulls below 10. And our fifth out of these 10 that had below 1,500, 1,086, September 26th, negative 8,921 net, only 3 pay-in-fulls. So when we look at these 5, July 28th, August 22nd, September 12th, September 19th, and September 26th, and this kind of shocked me. 4 out of 5 had less than 25K net. 1 out of 5 was $10 off, by the way, from 25K net. 1 out of 5 had above 10 pay-in-fulls. 4 out of 5 had below 10 pay-in-fulls when they had less than 1,500 registrants. So what did we learn in that example? Well, to be clear, we learned, okay, if they fall below 1,500 registrants, and look how close it could be, 1,332, like that's not that far off. You know, that's not terrible. 1,203, you know, that's not that far off from 1,500. 371, obviously that's dramatically far off. And then September 19th and September 26th, they were essentially both 1,000, 1,069 and 1,086. About 400 and some change off on those. It's not dramatic. You know, it's not dramatic on some of them specifically in terms of how far off they were from 1,500. But once again, okay, 1 divided by 5 in terms of success having more than 25K net at least. And like I said, it was $10 off technically, so it was really 0 out of 5. However, 1 out of 5, that's 20%. So the game became really simple here. If they're gonna continue running this webinar model, okay, and keep in mind, they're coming off of a net negative webinar. So when you look at this is what a lot of businesses do. They end up losing money on something and they make these like silly decisions. And they start saying things like, okay, I'm no longer gonna be able to spend money on this. I have to like pull back the spend because it just lost money, okay? And these are natural things that kind of come up, you know, in human psyche when you're looking at it from an advertising perspective. You just think, well, I just lost money doing it, you know, I gotta pull back the spend. But in reality, look at it like this, okay? As simple as this is, well, hear me out, okay? If they continued to spend less because this trend's down, you know, it went from 50,000 to 11,000 to 8,000 to negative 8,000. That's not a very good trend, you know? So webinar over webinar over webinar, they've failed to get off the amount of spend that was necessary to get to above 2,000 registrants. That's what we all kind of psychologically agreed. That was kind of the number in all of our heads where we said, okay, we know we need more than 2,000, but it wasn't as clear as what this made it. This made it inarguable. If we have less than 1,500 registrants, we have a 20% success rate of having a 25K net webinar. If we have more than 1,500 registrants, literally by only a few people, 1,595, 1,554, that's above the 1,500 number by a handful, dozens, but it increased the probability. That tipping point was so significant that once again, if it was below that number, there was only a 20% success rate, a 20% probability of the webinar netting more than 25K. If it was above that number, it had an 80% success rate, okay? An 80% probability of netting plus 25K. Just take a moment, right? How obvious is that you'd want more than 1,500 registrants no matter what? You do whatever it takes, okay? And sure, this is where we could add some additional data from that point. Column F and column G, we could add in cost per lead and we could add in ad spend so we can also see, as an example, maybe this August 18th webinar that had above 1,500 registrants, but only net 7,535, maybe it had a significant amount of ad spend. You know, maybe it had a significantly higher cost per lead. That'd be when we then want to add in that data, okay? Because it just gives us some additional auxiliary insights. But the key here, the key was to find the tipping point in the stats that removed randomness. Understand how critical that was. Literally dozens of people above 1,500 tipped it to 80% versus, once again, if it was below it only by like 100, 200, well, 20% odds, good luck, buddy, you know? So to be clear, I took that same lesson, okay, and I sought it out in other clients. Tried to figure out, okay, was there something going on inside of deals that we do that were indications of there's a tipping point here that we can't see, And can we chart it? Can we try to put it into a table like what we've done here in this example? So I had another consulting client recently that we just tried this with, and man, the data was really interesting. And this is somebody who were just starting the process of figuring this out. So I figured this would also be great to bring up in this video for you today, because it's gonna give you some dramatic insight. And to be clear, it's also gonna show you how we get started with the process. So in this particular client's case, they run a high ticket offer, typically through a call funnel, okay? They only use call funnels, no webinars, nothing else. And their call funnel historically has ran anywhere from like a $200 to $900 cost per qualified call, give or take the ad channel. They mainly run on Facebook and Instagram, and they have Google as well. Google's much more of like a secondary player in this specific company's case. They spend far less on Google. They spend far more on Facebook. This specific client, okay, they would have been the 39th person that we've helped get to $1 million months. They did $948,000 in the month of September. They were so close, $52,000 off, but such a shame. My rage for only being $52,000 short aside, I started asking this simple question because Google was underperforming by a drastic amount. In August, the Google advertiser had said they were at a 4 ROAS. Their internal statistics showed that it was a little bit above a 1 ROAS. It was almost a 2-to-1 ROAS for cash collected. The advertiser was factoring in payment plans in addition to the new cash collected. The company was only factoring in new cash collected. So when you looked at only the cash on cash return within that month, it was just shy of a 2-to-1 return. Now to be clear, well, the month of September is totally different. In the month of September, that ROAS was a 0.2, dramatically lower. Nothing good about that. Okay, it went from a little bit shy of a 2-to-1 all the way down to 0.2. And you looked at the difference, okay? And what we found when we started digging into the data, we looked at, once again, the key metrics, just like what we did here. First of all, we looked at, okay, what's the date? And we looked at month over month over month rather than week over week over week like we did in this first example I provided. So month over month over month, if you just looked at the first 2 months that we talked about, August and September, since August was good and September was bad, the call volume in August was a total of 22 scheduled calls that their closing team had taken. They have a setter-closer model. So when somebody initially schedules a booked call, they go to a setter first. The setters then have a show rate that has to be factored in. They have a cost per qualified showed call to the setter. They then have that handoff rate, okay? And the handoff rate follows. So they then go from the setter over to the closer, okay? Now from this perspective, once they get to the closer, same thing, there's a show rate, there's a cost per qualified closer call that then is factored in, and then they have the close rate. There were 22 of these closer calls that were qualified that showed up that were taken in the month of August, where they had just shy of that 2-to-1 ROAS. When you looked at September's number, when the ROAS was only 0.2 in comparison, okay, there was a little discrepancy here, there was anywhere from 15 to 17 calls. The person responsible for the sales team, the sales manager, said there was 17. Their head of operations, who tracks the data a little differently, said there was 15. So to be clear, that's a 5 to 7 call difference between August and September. When you look at that statistically, assuming it's a 7 call difference, that's about a 32% gap in terms of total call volume, just to be clear, even though it seems rather insignificant. At low volumes, everything kind of seems insignificant. If I have an $8 lead and it goes to $12, it doesn't really look that bad. It's like $4, but percentage-wise, that's a dramatic lift, okay? Now, I digress. My point being, okay, 32% was the discrepancy in their gap here between, once again, the quantity of calls that happened in August for the closers versus the quantity of calls that happened in September for the closers. Could that have been the tipping point? Is somewhere between 15 calls happening on the closers' calendars and 22 calls, is somewhere in there the tipping point. So then what I assigned this specific team to go do in between our call that we just had and our next call is to map the data just like what I've shown you here. What they needed to now do was they need to figure out, okay, what is month over month over month, the quantity of calls that happened, specifically that showed up on the closers' calendars? What's the quantity in terms of revenue that they generated? What was the ROAS? How many pay-in-fulls were there? They had a few offers. And they, in addition to that, had a few downsells. So they needed to map like the main offer that was sold and how many of those people paid in full. That would all help, of course. In addition to that, they need to map ad spend. So you look at, once again, month over month, that's just the first column, just monthly. Second column would be ROAS. Third column would be total closer calls that showed up that were taken. Following column for them could be the total amount of pay-in-fulls, the total amount of sales, and then the following columns after that could be the breakdown of, who bought what, in terms of like what was purchased, the drop sells, the upsells, the regular, were they paying fulls? And then obviously you could add an ad spend as well if you wanted to, and just total revenue. To be clear, this would then highlight a a potential pattern that you could see. Now, this business historically, this is the type of business, and this is almost all businesses. It's quite an anomaly to find the opposite of what I'm about to describe. When something's underperforming or like close to break even, unless you're generating additional revenue and future payment plans that justifies essentially breaking even in month-over-month cash collected, you'll generally pull back on that channel, especially when you're losing money at like a 0.2 ROAS. The logic there would be, okay, well in August we did good, but in September we did poorly, therefore we should continue to pull back on that channel's spend. But in reality, just like what we showed inside of this webinar example, them pulling back in ad spend would actually dramatically increase the probability that they're below the necessary tipping point. It's catch-22 of losing money. You think in terms of logic, well, I gotta spend less now, you know, and I gotta start tweaking things and trying to figure out what I can do to get my conversion rate up or get my close rate up or get my audience to tweak and, you know, have better people show up on the phones. And there's all these like little things that you start to think you need to tweak. And in some instances, it's truly as simple as you literally just need to spend more money so you can get past the tipping point and have the probabilities dramatically playing more into your favor. So I told the business owner on that call, I told him straight up, I said, listen, I know this is gonna kind of seem a little ridiculous and a little dumb, but I'm actually gonna encourage you to spend more money this month, even though you only had a 0.2 ROAS on Google. And I'd actually, believe it or not, encourage you to spend more money than what we've historically spent, even when we've had great ROAS months. That 940K cash collected, having a solid return in the business, that enables you to risk a little bit of that cash on this gamble. You know, and that's what it is, to be fair. It's a gamble. It's ideally a calculated risk, and the certainty levels increase dramatically when you can find your tipping point within your stats. That's the point I'm trying to make. There's always a tipping point. At low volumes of whatever the statistic is, low volumes of registrants, low volumes of calls, whatever that stat is, there's a lot of randomness that has to be factored in. There's really no consistency that happens at low volumes of data and statistics. At high volumes of data and high volumes of statistics, we can typically find more consistency, but that consistency comes, once again, it's the whole point I'm trying to make, from crossing over the tipping point. There's some random key number in your stats where once you cross it, just like this webinar statistic of crossing 1,500 registrants, you go from 20% probabilities of success to literally 80%. Isn't it worth finding whatever the fuck that tipping point is in your stats? Okay, I think so. Look, you like content like this? You need educated on these types of topics in depth. You need held accountable to go through these things. You need your hand held to be able to do these things. Your marketing staff's not doing these kind of things. Hire your boy. Okay, I got a few different things in the description of this video that you can go through. First of which I think is one of the most valuable, of course, it's my Inner Circle program. If you're rich, you're trying to get a hell of a lot richer, there's no better program out there for you. Quarterly in-person masterminds right here at the Penthouse. We do those at the top of every quarter, January, April, July, and October. We stream them live if you can't come in person, and of course we record them as well. We have our weekly group calls on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Same thing, if you can't show up to those live, you're also welcome to watch the recordings of those. We have an entire training library specific for our Inner Circle members on that. We do twice a month one-on-one calls together. One of my favorite things to do. I truly enjoy talking to the Inner Circle members. It's just so fun, you know, talking to people who are highly ambitious and, you know, have problems like this that I can help work through. And obviously there's a lot of revenue on the other side of that for you and your business. So I'm always excited to help. And in addition to that, we got our group chat on Telegram that we use where it's very active. I participate in it all the time, of course. I love it. And more important than anything else, it's just packed full of people that are rich and trying to get a hell of a lot richer than they are right now. I also just added in the description of these videos, now you can go check it out in the instance you want to work with us as a marketing agency and have us come in and do all this stuff hands-on, or maybe you're interested in a consulting deal as well. We have a link down there for an application, very simple application. Go through it, answer the questions honestly. We'll have my sales staff reach out to you and vet you a little further, and then we'll potentially set up a call together in the instance that it's a good fit and the right kind of offer that we can help with. And to be clear, even if you're a noob, or you're somebody that's just getting started, or hey, maybe you just don't want to pay us a recurring fee for some of the things that I just mentioned, you can always go through one of my courses. I have a 7-week live class called Master Internet Marketing. It's in-depth information just like this, all taught at a very advanced level from the perspective that I give you, and I get tremendous feedback from those who go through that program. And you also get lifetime access to it for all the additional updates that we put into there in the future. That's a one-time cost, of course, and you can get one of the 7 weeks totally free. There's a link for that down in the description as well. At the very least, I appreciate you if you've made it this far into the video. Thank you so much for being here and watching. Check out some of my other content, and of course, subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment something that you got out of it, and I'll see you in another. Go out there and make some money. Bye.